Okay, welcome back. This is so much fun, I thought we'd do it again. 3 hours coming your way, coast to coast and around the world, with some wonderful people and remarkable information. It's all out there for you to use as you will. That's the best we can do, and what we can't cover here, it's certainly covered on the site. Up first tonight is Frank Joseph, who was supposed to be here last week. Fortunately, he is able to be here this week. Very busy life, like many of us. Things come up, things happen. But he's back tonight, and what do you have on the menu this evening, my friend?
Well, I'd like to discuss something with you and our listeners that's always been particularly interesting, I think, from your point of view, mine, and that is the possibility of extraterrestrial contacts of the non-living kind. I'm referring to asteroid, meteor, and comet impacts in the history of our planet, going right up to modern times. And they, I think, are something that is of really deep concern to people that think about these things.
Well, it should be. And frankly, when you look at, I guess it's the whole Gulf of Mexico on the west side, as you look at a map, that whole curve in there, it is suggested that that is what's remaining of an enormous impact crater, as you know. It includes Yucatan and whips all the way up the east coast of Mexico and around Galveston. It's a perfect, it looks like 2/3 of a circle, or half of a circle. So the point is, this planet has been here 4.5 billion years. And if you don't think it's been hit many times, you really should think again. These things go by here all the time. And Frank, what really gets me is when you see these little tiny stories, football field size asteroid whips by the Earth between the moon and the Earth, and we didn't see it until it was already past. Those kinds of things. It's crazy out there. That we don't know. We can't track them all.
No, the fact of the matter is we live in a shooting gallery.
That's well said.
It's only a matter of time before there's a really important impact. I've been interested in this subject, as I'm sure you have been, for a very long time. And the first time I got interested in it, I was 9 years old when my family took me. Family had a trip out to the Southwest, and we went to a place called Meteor Crater in Arizona. It's called the Barringer Crater.
Yeah.
And back in those days, in the 1950s, science was divided on whether it was actually a meteor or not, because by the 1950s and well into the 80s, believe it or not, there was no consensus on scientific opinion that meteors really have ever done anything of any significance to the Earth.
Oh, really?
And
That's called deaf, dumb, and blind science.
Yeah, well, that's science all over. Well, not science, but scientists all over. Conventional scientists, which just go by the book. But at the time that my family took me there to see it was called Meteor Crater because the fellow that owned the property, Mr. Barringer, they named the crater after him, he was convinced that it was a meteor. And even though science at that time, in the 1950s, was overwhelmingly against it being a meteor, they thought it was a volcano.
It doesn't even look like a volcanic crater.
No, it doesn't even look like a volcano.
No,
but they insisted that, well, it must be. Well, I'm not going to bash these scientists because that could be a whole dismal program.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No.
Some of them deserve it. This
alone.
Is silly.
But the reason I bring that up is not for personal reasons entirely, even though they got me interested, and I've been sort of studying this ever since. What was interesting about it is that mainstream science had said, as I mentioned, that it was probably a volcano and not a meteor, and it was not recognized. If you can believe this, you can look this up in Wikipedia. I think they have it there, an article on it, in which it was not really admitted that it was caused by a meteor until the 1980s. It's amazing.
And we think we're so advanced.
What's interesting about it is that the native people in that area had a myth about it. And the myth is extremely interesting. The myth says that one day a devil was kicked out of heaven And as he came to the Earth, he burst into flames and fell into what is now Arizona, creating that, what they call an astroblem. Well, I think that's terrific. That myth is, like all myths, they are a poetic recreation of actual events. That's how you were able to preserve important information for future generations. You may surround something that's important to you with a kind of a poem or a beautiful story. And I thought, well, this is an obvious representation in myth of a meteoric event that took place. This flaming devil coming out of the sky that lands there and created this hole. So that was kind of amazing. Then years after that, after I grew up, of course, I've never really entirely grown up, but nonetheless, when I was interested, especially in studying Atlantis, and we've talked about this in the past, I came into contact with information about the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age spanned roughly about 3000 BC to about 1200 BC. And that was an extremely high period of human civilization. It was the birth of literature, terrific construction, masterful construction. All the arts and sciences were really blossoming from Minoan Crete and ancient Egypt and so forth. These civilizations are, of course, still highly impressive in their arts and sciences. And all that had been built up over thousands of years came to a roaring halt overnight. It just ended. The entire Bronze Age did not go into a decline. Far from it. It was the Bronze Age civilizations like Egypt and so on, Assyria and all the rest, pre-classical Greece and so on. The Etruscans were all reaching very high, all these levels of society, when they just stopped, right around 1200 BC. And that was always a great mystery for historians. What on earth caused it? And all these different theories were proposed, and none of them worked. None of them were inclusive enough. Not war, not disease, social dislocation. None of those things fit in, because this was all across the board. And it wasn't until the end of the last century, in the 1990s, when there was a symposium that was held at Fitzgerald College in England, that brought out a terrific paper, which is regarded now as a kind of a scientific event horizon. And in this paper, the scientists, the geophysicists, astronomers, and so on put on a very strong case that has become stronger over the years, that the Earth had a very close call with a huge comet. At that time, a dangerous comet. It still exists. It is no longer huge. It is no longer dangerous, because when comets continuously go around the sun, they lose more and more of their strength. But in 1198 BC, boy, they nailed it down. That's really close to 1200 BC.
Yeah.
Comet Encke made a very close pass to the Earth. A very close pass to the Earth, and in doing so, it rained down a barrage of meteoric material, which decimated civilizations from Shang Dynasty China all the way through Aegean Greece, set fires all across North America. It was regarded as one of the most horrible periods or epochs for human beings that human beings ever witnessed. And after it passed, all of these civilizations were either shaken to their core or wiped out. To give an idea of the expanse of this disaster, the entire Black Forest of Germany was incinerated, burned to the ground. The population of the British Isles, the human and animal population of the British Isles, went virtually extinct. And the level of devastation is incomprehensible. And what followed was a dark ages that lasted almost 5 centuries. And so now the meeting of science and history, geoscience and history, has pretty much nailed that down. It's not talked about much in the public, which is a shame, but it's known amongst scholars that this is what happened.
Question. Comet Encke, when it went past the Earth, obviously the Earth passed through its tail. That's where
the
all that
Northern
material
Hemisphere
came
did,
from.
yes.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And
Mm-hmm.
when you say the Black Forest burned, it wasn't incinerated in a matter of hours. It caught fire and burned down over, what, a period of time? A week, two, whatever, something. Or was this thing so hot and the debris so incendiary that it did just basically go up in a big conflagration? What did they know?
The entire Black Forest burned down in a matter of days, maybe 2 days.
Wow. And when you say 500 years of dark ages, are we talking about smoke and debris remaining in the atmosphere like a nuclear
we're talking
kind
about
of a winter?
No, not that so much. There was the result of a kind of a winter, exactly as you say, a global winter, but that did not persist more than 10 years maximum. It had, of course, a very deleterious effect on agriculture and so forth. The Egyptian records are very clear at that. They describe this. There's something called the Harris Papyrus, which is extremely valuable. The Harris Papyrus is a non-religious text which talks about conditions in Egypt at the time of the coronation of Ramses III, who was one of the last of the great pharaohs. And he was a great pharaoh. And his coronation was regarded as an ill omen, because it says in the Harris Papyrus, people walk around like crows. They cannot keep their garments clean because of all the vast ashfall that was in the air. No, the Dark Ages, to answer your question, was a dark ages of the lack of the civilized arts. Civilization had been unhinged, and literacy went out, barbarism flourished. Things were it was like the Dark Ages that followed the fall of the Greco-Roman world in the mid to late 5th century AD. That, of course, was a human-made catastrophe. But the natural catastrophe that took place in 1198 BC pushed civilization to the very brink of extinction. And very slowly, over the course of more than 4 centuries, people began to reknit the past, and the birth was that of classical civilization. And everything that we know about Western civilization really began about maybe 800 BC, because everything before that was wiped out, unknown. Egypt did not fall. It was one of the few civilizations that did not fall, but it was shaken badly and never really recovered its original strength after that. But I bring that up because this is an example which is now accepted. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is a comet. I want people to. This is not an asteroid or a meteor, known as a meteorite when it comes into the Earth's atmosphere and makes landfall or burns up. Meteors and asteroids. Asteroids are large meteors. To date, up to this point in time, it's my understanding that astronomers, what was that number, have found, just a second, 8,000. More than 8,000 near-Earth asteroids that are at least minimum 460 feet in diameter, width. 8,000 of them, okay?
Yeah.
But it is said that that's only 1/3 of the amount of large asteroids that are in Earth orbit, potential impact orbit. There are at least 25,000 of these things that are 460 feet wide minimum. That's a lot of stuff up there.
At the same time, they're generally not dangerous. And the reason why is because they have their own trajectories and orbits. From what I understand, those objects that are in near-Earth orbit, they seem rather frightening, but they're not, mostly. The ones that are dangerous, we're talking not about comets, we're talking about, like you said, asteroids or meteors now.
Yeah.
The ones that are dangerous are the ones that are many, many millions, billions of miles away in the asteroid belt. The asteroid belt is this area between Mars and Jupiter that has countless numbers of fragments, meteors, asteroids, planetoids, circling around in this great belt. Sometimes there'll be what is known as a wanderer a wanderer planet. This is a planet that has no fixed orbit anywhere, or a large asteroid will will go through the asteroid belt, and it will disturb various phenomena in that area, various meteors. Those meteors then will fall towards the sun, and when they do that, they have the potential to intersect with the orbit of some other planet, including our own, and cause a collision. This is, if you look at the latest that's come out on, and I did this in preparation for this program, looked at the latest on Chelyabinsk. We can talk about that later, and of course the big one, which was the Tunguska event. It's now believed that both of these events, and possibly others, came from the asteroid belt. They were not near-Earth asteroids or meteors. There was some disturbance. Something came through the asteroid belt. Is too far away for us to know, and that caused this disturbance, and they began falling towards the sun. That's similar to what happened with a comet, which was also in that area, or they're not sure, maybe it was in the asteroid belt. There are comets in the asteroid belt, too, relatively few, which was disturbed. That came by Shoemaker-Levy in 1994. That's also believed that Shoemaker-Levy's origin was somewhere around, or if not in the asteroid belt. But these ones that are close to us, they can be disturbed too. And if something passes close to them and affects their gravitational momentum, it's possible that they could intersect with us. So it's worrisome also. Absolutely. It's kind of a worrisome thing. The more you study this, the more unsettling it becomes.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. So the big danger is a comet. How many comets approximately do they expect to... they're tracking these all the time as best they can. Do they expect to come this way anytime, 25 years from now? In the next couple of decades.
I don't believe that science has reached the point where there's any way of making a useful estimate of that. The comets are not necessarily more dangerous than the meteors or the asteroid. I think they're all potentially dangerous. But as preparing for this show, because I'm so interested in this, and there's always new things to learn about it, some of these objects that we thought were meteors or asteroids or comets were something else. And I don't know what these things were, and I don't believe science knows what these things were or are either. So you might call them extraterrestrial or whatever, or a phenomenon we just don't know anything about. I mean, because like the Tunguska event.
I was going to ask you to go back to that. Let's go back there and tell the people. Let's tell the people what the most fascinating argument that was not a normal occurrence. And that argument comes from the eyewitness testimony of more than a few people.
Quite a few people. And the Tunguska event has never been regarded as normal in any sense of the word at all by anyone, not even conventional mainstream cosmologists or astronomers will say, oh, well, this was just a meteorite or something. No, I don't think there's any that say that. They're perplexed. And the more you look into it, the more bizarre that incident becomes. What we're talking about, for those of our listeners not familiar with it, on June 30th, 1908, there was an explosion over Siberia. Of course, this is long before the advent of an atomic bomb. And this explosion was so huge, to describe it in just megatons and so on, the mind can't grasp it. But just to give you an idea of when this thing exploded, 770 square miles of forest were absolutely flattened within less than 1 second. Now, that is very hard for our minds to imagine such a thing happening.
Not burned, flattened, knocked over, flattened to the ground, just like somebody stepped on them.
As though a hand came down and pressed them all to the ground. Some of the damage done in 1908, that's over 100 years ago, actually more than some. A lot of the damage is still in evidence today.
Uh-huh. Fascinating.
I hear the music.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, this Tunguska event, I remember what they did. They've done television episodes on this a number of different times. X-Files did one venue there, and fascinating. The more you read about it, the more enigmatic and strange it becomes. We'll be right back with Frank and hear more about this in just a minute. Okay, Tunguska, Tunguska, Tunguska. Look it up, do some reading. It's well worth your time. But we're going to tell you quite a bit about it now. And this is, again, an unprecedented event. We have no parallel to it that I know of. This is really good. If they don't know about this, do some research, but we're going to tell you now some things that probably will pique your interest quite a bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, like I say, on June 30th, 1908, this terrific explosion took place in a very remote part of Siberia. It was so remote, in fact, that there were maybe only 3 or 5 people that were killed and a number of animals. There were a number of people that were injured, nobody that seriously. Most people were knocked off their feet. But what's interesting is that the recalculations on this particular object, they find that it exploded 3 miles up. It was an airburst. Now, 3 miles is only 15,840 feet. Most airliners fly almost twice that altitude. So if this thing had exploded in modern times, it would have knocked who knows how many aircraft out of the air or completely destroyed them.
Well, that's almost military tactical airburst height.
Yes,
for some
it is.
types
I never
of nuclear
thought of that
weapons,
before. That's absolutely
EMPs.
correct. That's a tactical explosion, maybe a little bit lower, but I'd say 15,000 feet. But yeah, very
EMP
good.
would be high like that. That's what they'd want. They want the coverage. So.
It would be for maximum. You're right. It never occurred to me, but that is, whether it's coincidental or not, that is the optimum altitude for doing as much damage as possible from a major airburst. And I mean a major airburst because it was at least 300 megatons of TNT. When you consider that the bomb that totally destroyed Hiroshima was 15 kilotons of TNT, it gives you some idea of the extent of this blast. If the blast had taken place not over some remote area of Siberia, but instead over New York, the city would have been vaporized. New York, London, any of the largest cities of that time, and their outlying areas would have been absolutely destroyed. Everyone would have been killed. There would have been no survivors from that. The object itself was pretty huge. It's decided that it was about 620 feet across. And that's a pretty good size, whatever it was. General consensus, I don't know if I can even call it a consensus, but thought on it is that it was not a meteorite in the sense that it was a stony object, because no verifiable stone evidence or rocky evidence has ever been retrieved, either from the trees or the area there at all. And it's thought that it might have been part of a comet, a large icy chunk that superheated in the atmosphere as it descended. It was traveling over 42,000 miles per hour. And when it exploded, it'd be the same thing as taking an ice cube out of your ice chest or your freezer and putting it under a blowtorch. It'll just pop, and that's the same thing that happened with that. That's a credible explanation, but it may not be the right one. The object itself exploding with that sort of damage potential was seen by many hundreds of people on the ground. Some of them were native people. They're called the Evenki, and they're rather an advanced tribe of people. They certainly stick to themselves, but they're kind of like Eskimos, but they've really got their one foot in the modern world, and they did have one foot in the modern world back in 1908 as well. So they're really quite a valuable people. So mostly these Elenki natives saw it, but there were also reporters that saw it. That's interesting. There's a major newspaper at that time called Sibir, and a reporter for Sibir witnessed it. Also, the head of a trading post saw it. These were Russians. They were not Siberians. They were there from Russia. And some of their eyewitness accounts are now available. They become available after the fall of the Soviet Union, because these reports were taken down soon after, between about mid-1920s and 1930, by Mr. Kulek, or Dr. Kulek, I guess he was, who interviewed some of these people. And I'd like to read just an excerpt for you from this newspaper. A reporter for Sibir. This was an eyewitness account. And this brings out something, I think, particularly unusual. These accounts, by the way, I would say one more thing about them, is that these accounts were repeated almost detail for detail by dozens or hundreds of witnesses, both the native people and Russians that were working in the area. This is what this one reporter for Sibir newspaper had to say. He says, he and peasants, I'm quoting now, peasants saw to the northwest, rather high above the horizon, some strangely bright, impossible to look at, bluish-white, heavenly body, which for 10 minutes moved downwards. The body appeared as a pipe or cylinder. The sky was cloudless. Only a small dark cloud was observed in the general direction of this bright body.
You know what that could have been, Frank? That dark cloud could have been a shadow underneath it. Even chemtrails leave shadows, dark-looking shadows underneath them. So that's a possibility. Now, can you explain to me how an asteroid or a meteor looks like a cylinder or a pipe?
Now, let me bring this out, too. He is saying that this object was seen 10 minutes before the explosion. 10 minutes. I mean, if you're going to see an asteroid or a comet or something, it's not going to hang around in the sky for 10 minutes before it explodes. Now, let me finish reading this. It's not too long. The day, quote, the day was hot and dry. As the body, now he's not referring to this as a meteor or a comet. He's used the word, as the body neared the ground by the forest, the bright body seemed to smudge and then turned into a giant billow of black smoke, and a loud knocking, not thunder, loud knocking, not thunder, was heard as if large stones were falling or artillery was fired. All buildings shook, and at the same time the cloud began emitting flames of uncertain shapes. Now, he goes on to say that the object, before it exploded, 10 minutes before it exploded, and this is repeated by both natives and Russians, changed course in air. It didn't go straight. It made a turn, made a kind of a turn. Okay, now this next one is from
I find that to be, excuse me, but I find that idea that someone saw it change direction really interesting.
Not really someone, interesting. Many.
Yes,
many.
Understood. Yeah.
Then from Krasnoyarsk's newspaper, another eyewitness to it, and like I said, these eyewitnesses are being discussed because they are repeated by others who are saying basically the same thing. It says, at 7:43, the noise akin to a strong wind was heard. Immediately afterwards, a horrific thump sounded, followed by an earthquake that literally shook the buildings as if they were hit with a large log or a heavy rock. The first thump was followed by a second, and then a third. Then the interval between the first and third thumps was accompanied by an unusual underground rattle. similar to a railway upon which dozens of trains are traveling at the same time. Afterward, for 5 or 6 minutes, an exact likeness of artillery fire was heard. 50 to 60 different salvos in short, equal intervals, which got progressively weaker. After about 1 to 2 minutes after one of the barrages, so-called, 6 more thumps were heard, like cannons firing, but individually loud and accompanied by tremors. This one other one, I'm not going to be able to read the whole thing because it's kind of long, was by this man who ran this trading post. Actually, give me a second. I'm going to try to get... Yes. His name was Semenov.
Right.
And he's the Russian guy that ran this trading post. He says, at breakfast time, I was sitting by the house at the Tanabar trading post.
Now, take your time. No, go ahead. This is very good.
Okay, suddenly I saw that directly to the north, the sky split in two, and fire appeared high and wide over the forest. The split in the sky grew larger, and the entire northern side was covered with fire. At that moment, I became so hot that I couldn't bear it, as if my shirt was on fire. From the northern side, there was fire. It came in a strong heat. I wanted to tear my shirt off and throw it down, but then the sky shut closed, and a strong thump sounded, and I was thrown a few meters. I lost my senses for a moment, but then my wife ran out and led me to the house. After that, such noise came as if, now he's using the same analogy here. After that, such noise came as if rocks were falling or cannons were firing. The earth shook, and then I was on the ground. I pressed my head down, fearing rocks would smash it. When the sky opened up, hot wind raced between the houses, like from cannons, which left traces in the ground, like pathways, and it damaged some crops. Later, we saw that many windows were shattered, and in the barn, a part of the iron lock had been snapped. Well, I submit that this does not sound like a typical observation of a meteor fall or a close pass to a comet. One more thing I bring up about these testimonies, which are now all available online. They're fascinating to read. They bring up repeatedly that at least 3 to 5 separate explosions were heard. Not reverberations, one after the other, like the echoes, but over the course of time, 3 to 6 different explosions. Well,
what do you think? Over the course of minutes or many seconds?
Yes, over the course of several minutes.
Oh, come on, this is not a normal celestial event at all.
It is not a normal... I mean, they're seeing this bright, whitish blue body or object that looks like a cylinder making it turn for 10 minutes before it explodes.
Oh, no.
I submit that this was not... It could not be it's either a phenomena, a natural phenomena we know nothing of, or else it's something else.
No, it's not natural.
This is in the official record. This is not somebody theorizing or making this up.
No, look, as we know, and I think most all of our listeners know, the galaxy is full of life. And people have been coming here for billions of years, other life forms. It's 4.5 billion years old, our planet. Billion. What's our history? 10,000, 12,000 years? Sumerian tablets? Something like that? So, come on. Well, this planet has been home to any number of civilizations before us, the relics of which are to be found inside of rocks and coal deposits and all kinds of things. So, it could have easily been a large craft of some kind that was in real serious trouble, coming down, made a turn, and then lost it, and it blew.
Either that or maybe it was an experiment. Maybe it was deliberately done. And I think that point that you bring up about it being at the optimum altitude for an airburst, that's kind of interesting. Maybe they use it as a test. Let's go down there and test this thing out. Maybe they were, can't use the word humane, doesn't apply, but compassionate enough. They didn't try it over a city. They tried it over one of the most desolate areas, uninhabited areas on the planet, but they wanted to see what kind of effects it would have. And that'd be a good place because, hey, you can look down and see the tree, the pattern of destruction that you've got there. Maybe they were testing a weapon out. But I do not believe that this was a natural phenomenon like you. I think that it belonged to a superior civilization, an intergalactic, interplanetary, who knows what kind of civilization. They were either got in serious trouble, as you suggest, or else they used it as a testing area. Go down there and see. Like I said, I think it'd be a great place to test it because of all those trees. All you have to do is then see the distribution of the air blast, and this is what it can do. That's possible. But I don't believe, after reading these accounts, and they're all pretty much just like I read. I mean, they don't vary. That's the thing. They don't vary that much. The only variation has been in the number of explosions that were heard. Some say 2 or 3, others say 6. That's about all. But they do say multiple explosions, and not immediate like reverberations.
Now that's very odd. What, unless those explosions occurred, let's just call it wreckage on the ground. Things were on the ground and they exploded later after the initial massive aerial deconstruction of whatever it was. Or these were, how could they hang up in the air for several minutes going off? That's the question. This is a very, very bizarre and thought-provoking description. That was in the one you read was in the local newspaper.
Actually, all of those were from the all of those were newspaper reports, or they were collected by Dr. Kulik in the 1920s and early 30s. The other thing is that untypical also of this sort of a thing, although there's argument about it, the effects were such that this was so powerful an explosion that it was 5.1 on the Richter scale globally. In other words, you could have been in Hawaii.
Oh, it rang our bell.
Scale would have shown
it rang the whole planet.
The whole planet. And in Scandinavia, across Scandinavia, for 2 or 3 nights, I've not been able to pin it down any more than that. The nights were so bright that you could read a newspaper by it. After the 2 or 3 nights after the Tunguska event.
Well, come on, we realistically we can't even entertain meteorite, or asteroid, or comet.
No, I don't believe we can.
None of the above. No,
I don't believe we can. This whole phenomena gets more and more bizarre the more that's learned about it, and the more that's being disclosed about it. It's very, very strange. And I think that it had to definitely be something artificial, that it was not natural. I don't believe, I've concluded that it could not have been natural. I don't believe it at all.
I think that there may well be pieces of debris buried in the ground all over the place up there.
I don't know. After a 300 megaton explosion, there's not going to be an awful lot left.
No, I don't mean
but
big
maybe
pieces.
There is,
I
and
mean
maybe
small
the
pieces.
Kool-Aid picked up stuff that has been classified ever since. That's possible too.
Sure.
Yeah, we don't know.
Just like Roswell. Same thing.
Very well could have been. These other objects that we talk about, some of them are also peculiar. Chelyabinsk, you've mentioned this before, that when Chelyabinsk, this tremendous object, again, over Siberia. Why over Siberia?
Yeah.
That, of course, was very recent. And when the Chelyabinsk explosion took place, which was much higher up in the atmosphere, that was about 84,000 feet, which really isn't too high, but it's higher than an airliner goes. But something seemed to affect that or to interdict it.
Well, you can look at any of the videos. Just look at the Chelyabinsk meteorite, and type in Chelyabinsk meteor intercepted. Yeah. Let's try that word. You'll find videos on YouTube of this thing coming down, and then all of a sudden, up from below and the left side of the screen, moving to the right and up, is this pencil, we're back to a pencil-shaped object that went right through the Chelyabinsk meteorite, and you could see it come out the other side, and the meteorite at that point broke into lots of pieces. And it is suggested that that was a Russian surface-to-air intercept of that incoming meteor.
Well, it had to be a pretty good intercept because that puppy was going over 40,000 miles an hour.
Unless somebody else intercepted it for us.
Maybe. Well, the other part of that equation, I think, is fascinating because Chelyabinsk, it came out immediately afterwards. Chelyabinsk was the depot for all of the defunct Soviet Union's chemical weapons. They were storing, it was the greatest storage of chemical weapons on the planet when that event happened. The reason why they kept it there is because they had several processing plants in which they were trying, you couldn't do this overnight, matter of fact, very slowly to de-weaponize these horrible weapons. If that meteorite had struck Chelyabinsk, we might have been privy to one of the most horrible disasters that have ever struck our planet because those chemical weapons might have been exploded or they might have been detonated. And here we have this interdiction that took place. Something very strange about the Chelyabinsk thing. Very, very peculiar.
Well, when you watch,
it's peculiar that the meteorite, if that's what it was directed to target Chelyabinsk, and it's very peculiar that the visual evidence seems to indicate that there was some kind of interdiction.
Well, I've seen freeze frames of the object approaching it, going through it, just pierced it, and coming out the front, as it's, so to speak, as it's coming down, this meteorite, and it was something intercepted it. No, there's no doubt that unless it's all CGI, but I don't think so. There's a number of videos. You can find them on YouTube. Very interesting.
At the very least, there would have been horrific casualties at Chelyabinsk itself because Chelyabinsk is not an obscure town. It's a major city. There's 1,130,000 people living there.
Right. And that meteor was coming in aimed right at that facility you're talking about, and what are the odds for that? So was it really even a meteor, or was it some kind of a designed projectile launched by somebody at that target? And
the explosive force of the Chelyabinsk airburst was 33 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. I mean, that's just that's mind-blowing. The rock itself was heavier than the Eiffel Tower.
Or the cylinder.
Or whatever it was.
That's wild.
Amazing.
What a story. Thanks for reading those quotes. That's just remarkable material.
I think those quotes put it over the line.
Come on. They don't describe anything that sounds remotely like what we're familiar with. Nothing.
No.
Just completely bizarre.
It was not a meteor.
No. Thank you, Frank, for sharing that.
None of that.
No, none of the above. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm glad I have a chance to share it with you because I think that kind of clears the air in a way.
You bet. Good job. Okay. Well, we'll look forward to next visit.
Oh, me too. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I really had a great time tonight.
Good. Thank you. All right. Frank Joseph, and he'll be back next month. Always something phenomenal from Frank.